This opening move, 1. e4, immediately stakes a claim in the center of the board and opens lines for the queen and kings. Bishop, aiming for rapid development and aggressive play. This move initiates the Sicilian defense. A dynamic and imbalanced opening that immediately fights for central space and creates asymmetrical pawn structures, leading to sharp and complex middle games. This move, nf3, immediately challenges black's pawn on c5 and prepares to control the center, setting up the most popular transposition into the Sicilian defense. This move firmly establishes the pawn structure of the Sicilian defense, preparing to challenge white's central control and opening lines for the queenside pieces. This move, a check from the bishop, introduces the Rossolimo variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to simplify the position and disrupt black's pawn structure by potentially trading the bishop for the knight. This move, known as the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, aims to immediately challenge white's active bishop by developing black's own bishop to a defensive square and preparing to castle. This move, while seemingly simple, fundamentally alters the pawn structure and eliminates black's bishop pair, a significant positional concession for white in this variation of the Sicilian defense. This move recaptures the bishop, centralizes the queen, and prepares for development of the kingside pieces while also controlling the d7-h3 diagonal. This is a logical developing move in the Sicilian defense, which allows white to castle quickly and bring the king to safety while preparing to connect the rooks and control the center. Developing the knight to c6 is a flexible move that supports central pawn advances and prepares to challenge white's queenside initiative. Developing the d-pawn to d3 solidifies white's central pawn presence, prepares for a queenside fianchetto with b3 and b-flat 2, and opens a diagonal for the queen. This move solidifies black's pawn structure in the center and prepares to develop the kingside pieces, aiming for a solid, symmetrical setup common in many variations of the Sicilian defense. This move develops the knight to a more flexible square, preparing to support a central pawn advance or potentially reroute to a more active position on f1 or g3. This move prepares to fianchetto the dark-squared bishop, a common idea in many Sicilian structures to gain control of the long diagonal and support the kingside. This move aims to control the a5 square and prevent black's queenside counterplay, potentially preparing to expand on the queenside with b4. This move develops the bishop to its natural active square on the long diagonal, preparing to castle and connect the rooks while reinforcing the pawn chain. This knight hop to c4 aims to control the d6 and e5 squares, potentially preparing a central pawn push or reinforcing the knight's presence in the center of the board. This move develops the knight to a more active central square and prepares to castle kingside, aiming to connect the rooks and support the e6 pawn. Developing the bishop to an active diagonal, bf4 targets the c7 pawn and prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm or central expansion. This move boldly challenges white's centralized knight and opens the diagonal for black's queen, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain counterplay. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to trade off black's potentially strong bishop on g7 and potentially creating weaknesses around black's king. This move addresses the immediate threat of the bishop and knight attacking the kingside, while simultaneously preparing to develop the kingside rook to a more active square. Black finally castles, securing the king and preparing to challenge white's central control with a subsequent f5 push. This move prevents the knight on g7 from jumping to h5 to challenge the bishop on f4, maintaining white's control over the light squares and keeping the option of an eventual kingside pawn advance open. This move tucks the king away from the diagonal and potential central pawn breaks, while preparing to potentially shift the rook to a more active file later. This move strategically repositions the queen to support a central pawn push with d4 and prepares to potentially activate the queen on the c-file or support a kingside attack. This aggressive pawn thrust on the kingside aims to disrupt white's knight development and open lines for black's pieces, although it creates potential weaknesses around black's king. The bishop retreats to c3, repositioning to potentially challenge black's central pawn majority and prepare for a queenside expansion with b4. This pawn exchange on e4 opens the f-file for black's rook, potentially creating attacking opportunities on white's kingside, while simultaneously weakening white's central pawn structure. This pawn recapture opens the d-file for your queen and centralizes your knight while disrupting black's pawn structure. The move nd4 strategically challenges white's central pawn structure and opens up the c-file for potential pressure later in the game. This exchange simplifies the position and removes a well-placed knight from black's defense, aiming to gain a spatial advantage and control of the center. This recapture opens the e-file, allowing your queen to contest it and potentially exert pressure on white's center. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control the important d4 square and potentially support a queenside pawn advance. This move, 18, d5, boldly challenges white's centralized pieces and pawn structure, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and potentially disrupt white's coordination. This pawn exchange on d5 opens the d-file and creates an isolated pawn for black, aiming to exploit the long-term structural weakness. The capture of the pawn on d5 with the queen aims to reopen the center and activate your most powerful piece, contesting the initiative after white's pawn thrust. This move prepares to develop the queenside knight and potentially challenge black's d5 pawn, aiming to improve white's pawn structure and gain central space. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to challenge white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the open d-file. This move repositioning the queen to d1 is a strategic redeployment, aiming to support the knight on f5 and potentially prepare for future pawn pushes or piece activity on the kingside, while also keeping an eye on the d4 pawn. The move 21, Re8 repositions the rook to a more active file, potentially preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure and control the open e-file. This move repositions the rook to an active file, supporting a potential central pawn push or providing defensive cover for the kingside. The move h5 is an ambitious attempt to disrupt white's kingside control and create counterplay, but it weakens black's pawn structure and potentially creates targets for white's pieces. Trading rooks on the open e-file aims to simplify the position and potentially exploit black's uncastled king should white manage to open lines further. This move is a natural recapture, opening up the e-file for black's rook and reinforcing the center while preparing to challenge white's control of the open e-file. The queen retreats to f1, clearing the f-file for the rook and preparing to potentially redeploy to a more active square or support a kingside advance. This pawn thrust aims to open lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen, and create attacking chances by forcing white to either capture, strengthening black's pawn center, or allow the pawn to advance further. This move aims to solidify the queen's pawn and prevent black from creating further threats on the queenside with their advanced d-pawn. The knight repositions to d6, aiming to control the central squares e4 and c4 while also supporting the potential advance of the c-pawn, a key element in fighting white's kingside space advantage. This move simplifies the position by trading knights, which is advantageous as it opens up the d-file for your rook and allows you to exploit the d5 pawn if black recaptures with the pawn. After the exchange of knights, black recaptures the pawn, centralizing the queen and challenging white's knight on d6, aiming to simplify the position and activate her pieces. This move repositions the rook to the central e-file, aiming to exploit the open nature of the file and potentially contest black's control or prepare for future advances. This move repositions the rook to the open d-file, creating an immediate threat to white's isolated pawn and preparing to contest control of this crucial central column. This move aggressively challenges black's central pawn structure, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and create tactical opportunities on the kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, ready to support the advance of the d-pawn and potentially create threats along the b1h7 diagonal. This move repositions the rook to the third rank, creating attacking possibilities on the kingside and reinforcing the defense of the e-pawn. Preparing to contest the open d-file. Capturing the b3 pawn creates an immediate tactical threat against white's queen and opens up the possibility of further pawn advances to disrupt white's queenside structure. This move continues white's attempt to simplify the position and remove black's attacking pieces. But it also concedes the d-file to black's rook, which may prove to be a powerful asset. This recapture on d3 re-establishes material equality and simplifies the position. But it also opens the a2-8 diagonal for black's bishop and frees the d-file for potential rook activity. Black recaptures the pawn, aiming to maintain material equality and exploit the open queenside, but must remain vigilant of white's potential counterplay. This move initiates an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, seeking to exploit the open f-file and create attacking opportunities against black's king, which is now more exposed after black's queen has moved to the queenside. This move initiates a critical pawn confrontation, creating a passed pawn for white on the kingside while black aims to leverage their central pawn majority and open files for counterplay. This timely check forces the black queen to an awkward square, sacrificing tempo and allowing white to regroup and potentially exploit the exposed black king. Moving the king away from the dangerous g-file and potential checks on the dark squares is a necessary defensive maneuver given the current tactical situation. This move activates the queen on the open g-file, threatening checkmate and forcing black to defend the weak king. The rook on d7 was attacked and now has more options, aiming to reinforce the pawn chain and potentially create counterplay on the queenside or in the center. This move initiates a decisive king hunt, leveraging the open diagonal towards black's exposed king for a forced checkmate sequence. The king seeks refuge on the kingside, aiming to escape the immediate discovered attack and regroup behind its pawn shield. The move 36, qg5 repositions the queen to attack the pawn on g6 and prepare for potential mating threats on the kingside. This move begins to activate the queenside pawn structure, aiming to create counterplay and potentially a passed pawn to challenge white's material advantage and king safety. The move develops the bishop to an active square, aiming to challenge black's central pawn majority and potentially support a kingside attack if black commits their king to the center. This move activates the king, bringing it closer to the center and potential king-side action, while also preparing to defend the d-pawn if necessary. The move h4 is a logical strategic decision aimed at securing the king and potentially preparing an attack on the kingside by creating more space for your pieces and preventing black's knight from coming to g4. This check forces the white king to an exposed square, allowing black to further disrupt white's defenses and potentially create mating threats or win material. This move is a defensive maneuver to avoid the check from the black queen and keep the king safe from further immediate threats. This move brings the queen to a central, active square, threatening white's unprotected bishop on f4 and aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure. This move forces a liquidation of material, leading to an endgame where white aims to utilize their active king and passed pawn to secure a win. With the exchange of queens, white has simplified to a favorable endgame where their king is more active, aiming to exploit black's potentially weakened kingside pawn structure.